I am a Hungarian-born, Hungarian-speaking Jew, born in
Let me hold this for you. I'll hold it for you.
okay, born in Krájháza, a small town in Czechoslovakia, in subcarpathian Ruthenia. We had 100 Jewish families in a town of 5,000 people. We had 2 synagogues. The larger one was Ashkenazi, and the other one was Hasidic, where Yiddish was spoken. The members of the Ashkenazi synagogue were Orthodox and spoke Hungarian and Yiddish. There was no industry of any kind. The Jews were merchants and tradesmen, like tailors and shoemakers and so on. Our town was an important railroad junction and refueling station owned by the government. All government jobs were well paid, but the Jews did not work on the railroads because they would have had to work on Sabbath. There was no welfare of any kind, and there were many poor people. Czechoslovakia was a liberal democracy created in 1918. There were many schools of all kinds. In our area, there were 3 nationalities: Ruthenians, who spoke Russian, who spoke a Russian dialect, Hungarians, and Jews. The elementary school was only 4 grades. My father was a devoted Zionist. For a while, he was the only one in the congregation. Therefore, he sent me to a Hebrew elementary school. At the age of 8, I traveled by train to the next town to school. After elementary school, there was a choice between a 4-year school or an 8-year gymnasium for students who were going to continue their studies at the university. There was only one Hebrew gymnasium, which was in Munkac, a 2.5-hour ride by train from Kirahazo. So I had to live with another family in Munkac. This was a very unique school with students from near and far. In my class, there was even a student from Prague. I graduated in 1939, just as the war began. So I had no opportunity to continue my studies. I returned home. There were big changes in Karpathorus because the Hungarians were the allies of the Germans, and as a reward from Hitler, they were returned some territories that they had lost after the First World War. We were no longer Czech citizens. Our area was now governed by Hungary. My destiny was that of a Hungarian Jew. The tragedy was that the Hungarian Jews almost avoided destruction as part of the Holocaust. Only on the last year of Second World War, between May 1944 and May 1945, it was already very clear that Hitler was losing the war. The Nazis were retreating from Russia all the way to Berlin. Eisenhower was not willing to sacrifice 10,000 American lives to march to Germany. As a result, Berlin was liberated by the Russians May 2nd, 1945. The war ended May 8th, 1945. As a result that the Russians were allowed to march to Berlin, a lot of small countries in Europe were occupied by Russia, which was a very bad thing. In 1944, as Pesach ended, the next morning at 5 a.m., 2 policemen entered our house. We were told, you have 2 hours time to get ready to leave the house. We were in a shock. At the time, bread was rationed. We had no matzah left and were planning to bake bread. The next morning. We eat to commemorate Yetziat Mitzrayim by eating matzahs. They went from slavery to freedom. We went from freedom to slavery. No. Hitler knew that he was losing the war, but he managed to win the war against the Jews by killing 6 million of us. The Nazis conducted a blitzkrieg in Hungary. Out of 600,000 Jews, 437,000 were taken to Auschwitz in the record time of 6 weeks. 5,000 Jews were killed every day. After spending 6 weeks in the ghetto, my family was one of the first ones to reach Auschwitz. We were packed 80 people into a cattle car without any food or drink. We had no idea where we were going. We traveled about 4 days and nights. After starving for 4 days, you are not hungry anymore, just very thirsty. We had never heard of Auschwitz. The only concentration camp we heard about was Dachau. When we reached our destination and the train stopped, the doors of the cattle cars opened, and since there are no steps to get down, I do not know how the elderly and the sick got off the train. The Nazis were yelling, "Schnell, schnell." They did not give the people time to think. The men and women were immediately separated. We had to line up 5 people in a row. We had to walk very slowly in front of Dr. Mengele, who was, as an irony, a physician. In my row were my grandmother, my mother, and a mother with a young child and me. That made 5. Mengele pulled me out. I protested, saying I wanted to stay with my family. His answer was, "They will come later." Those people were killed the very same day. They were killed with Zyklon B, and their bodies were burned in the crematorium or an open pit. That was the last time I saw my family. The Germans continuously lied and misled the people. They did not separate mothers from children because the aim was to have a smooth operation, and they didn't want the mothers crying by separating them from the children. After I was selected, I protested to Mengele, saying that I want to stay with my family. After I was selected, I was walking through a field, and being thirsty, I said, "Isn't there any water in this place?" But there was no one to answer me. I was told to enter a building. In the building, we had to get undressed, leaving our clothes on the floor and keeping only our shoes. After that, our hair was completely cut off. The girls who cut our hair were not allowed to speak to us or give us any information. Next, we went into a room with showers. After the shower, we were given a summer dress with no underwear. We came out of the building to a courtyard. It was drizzling and cool. We could hardly recognize each other without our hair. The concentration camp was actually outside of the town of Auschwitz, in a place called Birkenau. The camps took up a large amount of land. We were taken to Camp C, which consisted of 32 barracks. Each building was a long structure that had so-called beds that were three-tiered and built of wooden planks. Each bed was occupied by 10 girls, and we used our shoes as pillows. What was a day in Auschwitz? Every morning we were awakened while it was still dark and were taken to the toilet. In the middle of the camp, one barrack had the toilets, and opposite it there was one that had running water. Each day there were 2 Zählappels. We had to stand outdoors to be counted twice a day. This was mainly to torture us, since we were surrounded by electrified wires, which would have killed us if we touched it. It was very easy to commit suicide by touching the wires. But very few people did so because we did not lose hope and knew that eventually we would be liberated. Breakfast was a black liquid. Lunch was soup served in pots. People drank from these shared pots. Dinner was bread that looked like a piece of brick made with a lot of sawdust, and a piece of imitation cold cut or cheese was given. Aside from the Zählappel, we did nothing. I stayed in Auschwitz for 6 months. Since I learned to survive there, I did not volunteer for selections to go to the unknown. But in August, the situation became very bleak. We only found out at the liberation that an uprising took place and one of the crematoria was destroyed. At that point, there was a selection for 100 girls to work in a factory. The decision to go to this selection saved my life. We were sent to a factory in the Sudeten, which was part of the Czech Republic. This factory produced fine linens before the war, and now it was part of the German war effort, producing summer uniforms for the German army. Conditions here were 1,000 times better than in Auschwitz. Since there were German civilians working in the factory with us, we were given overalls and a towel, a great luxury after Auschwitz. The living quarters were better, but the food was the same as in Auschwitz. We were very, very hungry. If the stones had been edible, we would have eaten them. We were very lucky that we were not evacuated and sent on a death march. I am the only survivor of my family. My brother only 2 years younger than me, suffered through a whole year, but was shot on a death march 10 days before the end of the war. On May 6th, we were liberated by the Russians. They did not pay any attention to us. They were busy drinking and raping women. The trains were not running. We went to town and took food from the people who were too scared to resist us. We were anxious to get back home to see who survived. Some Jewish Czech soldiers on forced labor in Russia had been organized into a Czech army. They had liberated Prague. One day a truck came and some Jewish soldiers who were from our area gave us a ride. We had some fabrics from the factory and gave it to them. We were about 7 girls who were taken by them to Brno, where they had an apartment which they gave to us. We stayed there for a week. The train started running, and with the passengers who were all survivors. It took us 2 weeks to get home. At home, I found my aunt and her daughter who were liberated in December in Poland. A cousin who was not in concentration camp, but my brother did not appear. The Soviet Union annexed Carpathia, but luckily there was a law that anyone who wanted to retain their Czech citizenship had the right to do so. All the Jews left. We traveled to Prague, which took 2 weeks. We took out Czech passports and stayed in Prague until we were able to come to America. I got married in Prague in the Ordnungsschule in March of 1946. Every country had a quota of the number of people who were allowed to immigrate to the US. President Truman allowed all survivors to come to the US outside of the quota. However, every person had to have a sponsor who guaranteed that we would not go on welfare for the next 5 years. And no survivor ever went on welfare. My husband and I arrived in the US March of 1948. In June 1952, I gave birth to my daughter, Naomi. Thank you.
Olga's daughter, Naomi, is escorting her down to the